Hello everyone, it's James here at fullfat 4x4. Before we get into today's episode, as you can probably tell by the cars behind me, I'm always looking for L322 Range Rovers. So if you're thinking about selling your 4.4 TDV8, 5 litre supercharged, or even a low mileage 3.6 TDV8, do get in touch. Starting with the background, the 3.6 replaced the 3 litre TD6 in 2007. At the same time, the car received a mild facelift, with changes such as the introduction of an electronic parking brake and different seat types. In my opinion, it was a significant improvement. The V8 is much more suited to the L322 compared to the BMW-derived 3 litre straight 6. And perhaps more importantly, the introduction of the ZF6 6-speed automatic box was a night and day difference for the L322 compared to the GM 5-speed box, which it replaced and which did not enjoy a robust reputation. In 2007, the L322 also received a midlife facelift with some subtle changes compared to the 06 cars, such as the introduction of an electronic parking brake and the movement of the ignition from sort of down here up onto the dash. This generation of L322 then ran from 2007 up to 2010, where the L322 received its final facelift. The analog dashboard was replaced with a digital TFT, and the interior had a makeover, which is most noticeable in the autobiography models, which are significantly more luxurious. 2010 was also a cutover year for engines, where for a brief period of time you could buy the final facelift version of this car with the 3.6 TDV8. And that's what I'm in today. So, what's it like to drive? Well, it's a proper wafter. The combination of the V8 and the 6-speed box suits the L322 really nicely. It feels lively off the mark and willing up to about 50 miles per hour. From 50 to 70, it's okay, but it does start to feel like it runs out of puff beyond 70 miles an hour. And for most people, that is absolutely fine. It's also easy to mistake the 3.6 as being more torquey than the 4.4 off the line. And I think that's because this is a 6-speed gearbox, and so it holds onto the gears a little bit longer. The power delivery is also nice and linear thanks to the parallel turbo configuration. There are no flat spots and no surprises in the rev range. Overall, it's a very relaxing experience. Also noteworthy, the 3.6 models do not feature adaptive damping, so they can feel a little bit more wallowy in the corners. Similarly, they were not all fitted with 6-pot Brembo front calipers. So I definitely encourage you to treat your 3.6 like a gentleman would a lady, if that is the case. Now on to the facts and figures. Well, the 3.6 has 270 horsepower and 640 newton meters of torque, giving an alleged 0 to 60 of 8.6 seconds. Certainly no slouch, but it's not really the kind of car that you'd count that figure in anyway. It's also capable of towing 3.5 tons, and if you buy one, you can expect 24 to 26 mpg on a run, upper teens and low 20s around town. Unfortunately, VED is in the highest category of £760 per year. So what should you look out for on a 3.6? Well, if you have a hunt around on the internet, you'll find all sorts of horror stories on pretty much any Range Rover model. But the issue most talked about on the 3.6 engine is turbo failure. Although I would be really interested to see a data set comparing turbo failure for the 3.6 against an equivalent age and mileage BMW or Mercedes SUV. I think that would be a really good benchmark. So if you know of something like that, let me know in the comments below. Suffice to say, if you are thinking about a 3.6, I would recommend a healthy contingency of up to £4,000 to replace a pair of turbos if you are unlucky. The other main engine issue to look out for is exhaust gas recirculation valves. The EGRs on the 3.6 are a known weakness, and they can disintegrate and send debris into the engine. Now, if that does happen, you're probably into an engine rebuild or an engine swap. Thankfully, the EGRs are relatively straightforward to get to, and if you only intend to use your car off-road, blanking off the EGR valves could help reduce the risk of this failure mode. One of the major advantages of the 3.6 is that they were not fitted with diesel particulate filters. So if you do a lot of short journeys, or perhaps you are looking for a car to crawl around a farm or shoot, the 3.6 could be for you. I'm sure there will be lots of people in the comments below saying, if you do short journeys, get a petrol model. And again, that could be a good option. But there are less of these on the market, and prices for good condition petrol cars seem to be quite strong, probably because of the ULEZ factor. So you will need to decide for yourself if the premium paid for a ULEZ compliant petrol model is worth it or not. Overall then, the 3.6 is a great driving and well-mated engine and gearbox combination that I'm sure any Range Rover enthusiast would get along famously with. Right then, let's have a chat about the 4.4 TD V8. Well, just before we do jump into the 4.4 TD V8 to have a drive of that, I just want to very quickly talk about a couple of interior differences between the 3.6 and the 4.4. Both the cars in this example are facelift vehicles, as noted by the TFT dash, but the key interior difference is that the 3.6 has a gear selector, which is a stick, and it has a drive mode selector, which is rotary. And this corresponds with also having a ZF6 6-speed box. Now, when you compare that to the 4.4 TD V8, there is a rotary gear selector and then buttons to get your drive mode selection, and when the vehicle turns on, that will pop up. So it's a bit of a cleaner design. Allegedly, the Queen, the late Queen that is, had a preference for the stick style selector, and so rejected the new 4.4, the facelift model, back in 2010 when she was offered one. Well, we'll just fire this 4.4 TD V8 up and you will notice, there we go, the gear selector risers. The other key thing to note is that the 4.4 TD V8 is fitted with flappy paddles. Now, the majority of people will probably never use these. However, they are quite good for going down steep hills, especially if you're towing a caravan, or you just want to have a bit of fun. They're quite handy. You can keep the vehicle in the sort of, 3,000 rev range, and it does make for quite a fun experience. The 3.6 doesn't have that. That has a you take the gear selector, move it over to the left, and you can go up and down to control the gears. Well, I'm now sat in a 4.4 TD V8 Vogue, so it's a perfect comparison vehicle to the 3.6 TD V8 which you've just seen. So the background to this car, as I've kind of hinted at earlier, it was released in 2010. Now, the majority of 4.4 TD V8s are available with a 60 plate onwards until 2012. There are a few exceptions. For example, you may have seen in a previous video, I have one VX10 HZL. That is a 4.4 TD V8, which was actually a press release vehicle. So that will feature on the channel again shortly. The 4.4 then replaced the 3.6 TD V8 and at the same time introduced the ZF8 8-speed gearbox. And this was the final run for the L322. You could say it was its swan song. It ran from 2010 until 2012, at which point the L322 was retired and the L405 was launched. Well, I have said this before, but the facelift of the L322, so the last version of it, is definitely a much more refined place to be compared to the pre-facelift and the mid-life facelift vehicles. The overall cabin quality is just much higher, and it's generally a much nicer place to be. So let me tell you a little bit about the 4.4 TD V8. Well, this is a real powerhouse of an engine. It has 300 horsepower and the torque is over 700 Newton meters. It really is a monster of an engine, and it's, well, frankly, it's definitely overkill. When you compare it to the 3.6, which was perfectly adequate, the 4.4 is a real monster. It's the kind of engine where when you plant your right foot, you kind of get a sense that the earth turns around you rather than you turning around the earth. It's really that kind of car. It's also a sort of, how would you say, a modern wonder. So it is possible on the 4.4 TDV8 to get in excess of 30 miles per gallon on a motorway run. And that is thanks to the fact that this engine just has so much torque that when you're doing 70 miles an hour, you're probably doing 1400 RPM, maybe a bit less. The ZF 8-speed gearbox, which really is a sort of magic device. The shifts are lightning quick, and you just sort of get this sensation of progress being made. So I'm just coming up to a straight, and now the engine is kind of warmed up a little bit. I'm just going to plant my foot. So we're doing 20. Right, plant the foot. Okay, big surge of power at 3,000 RPM, all the way to 4,000, that's 60, and then we're into 70. Now, the big contrast with the 4.4 against the 3.6 is that this 4.4 feels like it just goes and goes and goes and goes, and it's kind of, well, it's relentless, in fact. Where the 3.6 feels like it's run out of puff at 70 miles an hour, the 4.4 feels like it would just carry on going well past speeds legal in the UK. So I think that could actually make this a pretty excellent Grand Tourer. I know that's probably not what you'd expect, you know, a 4-seat SUV. Well, that's not in the Grand Tourer classification, is it? But it is genuinely fun and engaging to drive. When you couple it up with the flappy paddles, you can actually have quite a lot of fun. And I have put 4.4 TDV8s through their paces around country roads, you know, obviously within the speed limit, but you can still have a lot of fun in spite of the fact that this is a 2.7-ton vehicle, which is, was a bit mad, really, when you think about how quickly it gets off the line. The 0 to 60 is sub 8, I think it's 7.5 off the top of my head. Again, obviously that's out of the factory doors. You know, by the time a car's got 100,000 miles on it, it's probably lost a few seconds off that. Well, I mean, not a few seconds, but a bit of time off that. So the point is, it's absolutely no slouch. And I'm just going to sort of, it is actually quite addictive. And it has got a great sound. Now, the 4.4 TDV8 is different to the 3.6 in terms of its turbo architecture. So the TDV8 is a sequential turbo compared to the parallel turbo of the 3.6. What that means is that you've got one turbo on the right-hand side, which kind of does the majority of the work up to about 2,500 RPM, and then you have another turbo on the left-hand side, which comes in after 2,500 RPM. Now, the benefit of this turbo configuration is that each turbo can be optimized for a specific rev range, because if you think about a turbo, it's basically a propeller, and the pitch of the turbo vanes dictates the performance of that turbo. So you can either optimize your pitch for lower RPM, or you can optimize your pitch for higher RPM, or you can optimize them for different flow rates. Now, in a parallel turbo configuration, your optimization, well, you can only optimize for one point in the rev range, whereas with a sequential turbo configuration, you can actually optimize for multiple points in the rev range. And so that's really quite obvious in the 4.4 TDV8, because it feels like there is an optimization point at about 1800 RPM. So when you're kind of not planting your foot, but you are, you know, you're making progress, you can feel the torque at 1800 RPM. And then when you really plant your foot and you want to go, you can feel another optimization point where it's about 3,000 RPM, and that's when the secondary turbo is really coming in and it's giving its most. And it's really noticeable when you've kind of driven a 4.4 for quite some time and you kind of really get used to it. You really notice those 2 points in the rev range, 1800, 3000. This does come with some drawbacks. So the secondary turbo, so there's this common misconception on the internet that, oh, the secondary turbo is not working up until 2500 RPM. Well, that's actually not true. The secondary turbo is always spooling. However, there is a charge air valve in the bottom left-hand side of the engine, and this is basically a bypass valve. It looks like a wastegate. This is only activated over 2,500 RPM to bring that charge air into the system. So what that means is that you do actually have to plant your foot to get the charge air from the secondary turbo brought into the system. And that kind of leads me on to one of the, I guess you could say, drawbacks of the 4.4 TDV8, things to look out for. So if you are buying a 4.4 TDV8, which has been cosseted and nursed and driven like Miss Daisy, well, there is actually a chance that you could be in for some issues with that bypass valve, because like any mechanical mechanism, it likes to get used, and if it isn't used, there is a risk that it could seize, and that can give you some weird faults thrown up in the OBD reader. So advice that I give to customers when buying a 4.4 TDV8 is, once you have got the engine nice and warm, floor it, and you'll love it, I promise. If you're a car enthusiast, there's nothing better than planting your foot on a 4.4 TDV8, and the engine will thank you for it. But it is caveated, do not do that from cold. You really want your engine to be nice and warm, ideally sort of 15 minutes of driving beforehand, just to get everything warmed up, maybe even 20 if it's a cold day. You don't want to be doing it from cold. That leads me on to other things to look out for. The 4.4 TDV8 is a Euro 5 emissions classification engine, and so that means that it has both exhaust gas recirculation valves and also a diesel particulate filter. Now, both of these systems are a bit of a pain in the backside, mostly around engine performance and also engine longevity. Starting with the DPF, because this vehicle is fitted with a DPF, it is not suitable for people who only do short journeys. If your sort of driving routine looks like a 3-mile round trip per day to the corner store and school and back, well, I'm afraid the 4.4 TDV8 isn't going to be for you, unless, of course, you want to modify the emission system, which would only really be suitable for off-road use. Other things to look out for then on the 4.4 TDV8, they have a known reputation for going through oil cooler gaskets. Now, the oil cooler sits on top of the V, on top of the EGR valve and EGR cooler. So it isn't too difficult to get access to, but it's around a 4 or 5 hour round trip if you're taking your time. It's definitely within the realms of a competent DIY mechanic, but you do need some specialist tools, primarily something to purge the coolant system of air once you change the oil cooler, because you do need to break the coolant system. So it's not a job for the faint-hearted, but it is achievable. Now, supposing you don't want to tackle that job yourself, a specialist would probably charge somewhere in the region of £600 to £700, depending on the specific part that they replace. So if they go for a genuine one, I think they're about £400, and if you go for an OEM make, you're probably looking at around £200. So depending on which parts are used, and also which bits break getting there. So that leads me on to the next thing to look out for, and that is the coolant system. So lots of the coolant system parts are made of plastic, and unfortunately over time these become brittle and can snap, perish, and cause coolant leaks for you. So you want to be looking out for that. I wouldn't necessarily say that was a 4.4 specific issue. I think that's just a sort of general old car issue. Other things to look out for then on the 4.4 TDV8, well, they have a known reputation for going through accessory drive belt idlers and tensioners. So if you're looking at a 4.4 TDV8 and it's got a bit of a squeak around the front of the engine, I would say it's a 95% chance that it's something to do with one of the idlers and or tensioner for the accessory belt. None of those things are the end of the world, and frankly, you can end up replacing those parts prematurely, because it's not a very nice sound, but it does create a bit of panic, I think, for owners, and so they end up going through multiple sets of idlers in the ownership of their vehicle. And the reality is that it's a bearing, it's a hot engine. the design of the accessory drive belt isn't the best. You know, there's big offsets between the bearing and the block, leading to lots of moments within those idlers and those bearings. So it is a bit of a pants design, but it's something to look out for nonetheless. So who then is the 4.4 TD-V8 best suited to? So I would describe the 4.4 TD-V8 L322 as the petrol head's dream practical vehicle. So it's a fantastic luxury cruiser that's capable of taking 4 adults in comfort, 5 at a pinch, all your luggage across a continent, across the country. The other great thing about it is that when you've done all that and you do want to have a bit of fun, you know, you plant your right foot, and it is actually genuinely engaging to drive, especially if you're on a good set of road tyres. The 4.4 TD-V8 was also fitted with adaptive damping systems, which does mean it takes some of the wallowiness out of the corners. It's never going to be a sports car, but it just helps to firm up the feel of the car when you are driving it with gusto. Now, I do really like the 3.6 TD-V8, but I would probably buy a 4.4 TD-V8, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that they are definitely the more desirable diesel car. I get lots of people asking me for a 4.4 TD-V8. I have less people asking for the 3.6. Albeit that is starting to change, and I think that possibly has something to do with a recent Harry's Garage video where he interviewed the CEO of Warranty Wise. The other reason that I would go for the 4.4 is the 8-speed gearbox. Now, I do really like the sort of almost laziness of the gearbox in that it does create very short shifts, and it does make for a very, I think, calm driving style when you are just pootling. It is also more suited to the types of journeys that I do. So if I'm going somewhere in the big car, it's probably a long journey with stuff, and having that emission system with the 4.4 TD-V8 isn't necessarily a bad thing for my journey. And that leads me on to the final point in terms of economy. So it is possible to get some really quite good economy figures out of the 4.4 TD-V8. Now, nobody buys a Range Rover for economy, and the two are kind of, I think, you don't really associate the word economy and Range Rover together, but it does help take the pain out of it when you can get 600 miles to a tank and in excess of 30 miles to the gallon on a motorway run. It does just make it a little bit easier to live with. And then the final reason that I would go for the 4.4 TD-V8 is because I actually think that the 4.4 engine is a bit easier to work on. I think that the packaging and the layout of how everything is structured in the 4.4 TD-V8 is much easier to get to, whereas the 3.6 almost feels like, well, they designed the block and then thought, where do we put all of these accessory systems? And so the 3.6 engine bay does feel a bit sort of piecemeal, with bits here and bits there, and there's hoses crossing over manifolds, and it's just all not very logical. Whereas the 4.4 layout feels much more logical, and you can get to systems without having to strip everything out. So being someone that likes to work on their own car, for me, I would prefer working on the 4.4 TD-V8. Now, if you don't fancy a 4.4 TD-V8, but you do want one of the last Range Rovers, well, your alternative could be a 5-litre supercharged V8 L322. And these are great fun to drive. And I have done a couple of videos comparing the 4.4 TD-V8 to the 5-litre. I have subsequently driven a few additional 5-litre supercharged, and yeah, they are good. Personally, though, I couldn't live with the fuel consumption unless it was a purely weekend vehicle, which, I think a lot of people buying an L322, they are buying it for the weekend use. But then I also have lots of people I speak to who are buying it as their main car. So for me, the 5-litre wouldn't work, as fun as it is. The other thing which slightly annoys me about the 5-litre market is that They've recently gone up in price quite significantly, and again, I think that is mostly because of the ULEZ factor. So the 5 litre is obviously ULEZ compliant. I say obvious, it's not that obvious, is it? But, you know, well, it's just ridiculous, isn't it? You can have a 5 litre petrol engine which is compliant in the ULEZ zones, but a smaller diesel engine isn't. Anyway, so for me, the choice would definitely be the 4.4 TDV8. I definitely think it's the best all-round L322. The engines have got a good, robust reputation, and they're just great to drive.